The bus rumbled to a halt at the edge of the valley, and Selene stepped onto the gravel road with a small duffel slung over her shoulder. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the landscape. Before her stretched Solara, a village unlike anything she'd ever seen. Sleek, gleaming solar panels rose in elegant rows on the hillsides, interspersed with vibrant gardens overflowing with sunflowers, herbs, and trellised vines. A narrow path wound its way through clusters of cottages, each roof adorned with the reflective shimmer of photovoltaic cells, blending seamlessly with the greenery that surrounded them. As she walked toward the heart of the village, the crisp air carried the faint hum of solar inverters, the rhythmic clatter of a nearby wind turbine, and the laughter of children playing somewhere in the distance. Selene's boots crunched on the gravel, and with every step, her earlier apprehension began to fade. This was nothing like the urban sprawl she'd left behind. Here the world seemed alive, breathing in harmony with itself. "Selene, right?" A warm voice greeted her. She turned to see a wiry man in his early 60s, his skin bronzed by the sun, his salt and pepper hair tied into a loose ponytail. He extended a hand. "I'm Ezra. Welcome to Solara." "Hi," Selene replied, shaking his hand. "It's even more beautiful than I imagined." Ezra grinned. "Just wait until you see the fireflies at night. Come on, I'll show you around." They walked together, and Ezra launched into a quick history of the village. "Solara started as a dream," he said, gesturing to the sprawling solar farm. "A few of us wanted to create a place where we could live sustainably, in balance with nature. That meant renewable energy, of course, but also rethinking how we grow food, how we build homes, how we connect with one another." He led her past rows of raised garden beds brimming with leafy greens and bright vegetables. A group of people were working quietly, their hands moving in a practiced rhythm as they weeded and harvested. "The gardens provide enough for everyone here," Ezra explained, "and we trade the surplus with neighboring towns. That's Olivia over there. She runs the greenhouse. She'll be your go-to if you need anything plant-related." Olivia glanced up, waved, and wiped her hands on her overalls before giving Selene a welcoming smile. They continued walking, passing a workshop where a young woman was repairing a bicycle and a group of children were painting a mural on the side of a communal kitchen. The scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the air. Ezra pointed to the mural. "The kids wanted to paint the story of Solara's beginnings. You'll see lots of art here. It's how we stay inspired." As they reached the edge of the village square, Ezra paused. "And this is where the magic happens." Selene stepped into the open space, her breath catching. A massive pergola, its beams entwined with flowering vines, shaded a gathering area filled with mismatched chairs and benches. Above, a canopy of translucent solar panels filtered the sunlight, creating dappled patterns on the ground below. Around the square were workshops, a small library, and what Ezra called the community hub. People bustled about, waving to each other, their movements unhurried yet purposeful. "It's incredible," Selene murmured, taking it all in. Ezra chuckled. "You'll fit right in. Solara thrives because of people like you, passionate, dedicated. You'll see." For the first time in a long while, Selene felt a deep sense of belonging. The valley seemed to hum with possibility, and she couldn't wait to dive in. The meeting was already in full swing when Selene arrived at the community hub, the late afternoon sun streaming through the solar canopy above. A circle of mismatched chairs had been arranged in the open-air space, each one occupied by a member of the planning committee. Selene slid into an empty seat near the edge, nodding politely as a few faces turned to acknowledge her. Ezra, seated near the center, was mid-sentence, gesturing animatedly with a pen. "So, the goal is to create something immersive, something that speaks to people, not just facts and figures, but their emotions, their core values," Ezra was saying. "This festival has to inspire a connection, not just information." Selene adjusted her notebook in her lap, scanning the room. The group was an eclectic mix, their clothes ranging from earthy, hand-knitted sweaters to sleek, minimalist attire. And then there was him. The man sat at an angle to her, leaning back in his chair as though he were perfectly at ease with the world. His clothes were unlike anything Selene had seen here so far. A dark, tailored vest, layered over a crisp white shirt, with sleeves pushed up to his elbows, his trousers almost vintage in style. A thin chain glinted at his wrist. His hair was slightly unruly in a way that seemed deliberate, and his eyes, a striking gray-green, were fixed on Ezra with an intensity that suggested he was listening, though his posture implied otherwise. Just as Selene decided he looked somewhat out of place, he spoke. "What we need," he began, his voice rich and deliberate, "is to create an experience that bypasses the conscious mind entirely, something visceral, something that resonates on a primal level." Selene blinked. The room had gone quiet, all attention shifting toward him. He sat forward now, his fingers tented as though weighing his own words. People don't change behavior because of graphs or statistics. They change because their assumptions are disrupted, because their emotions are engaged. We need to ask ourselves, what's the story we're telling, and how do we make them feel it? There was a murmur of agreement from a few people, and Ezra nodded thoughtfully. Selene felt her brow furrow. She scribbled a quick note in her notebook. "Resonates on a primal level," and leaned back, biting the inside of her cheek. The man's words had a certain poetry, but she couldn't help feeling they were vague, untethered. What did a phrase like that even mean in practical terms? Ezra gestured toward Selene. "Selene, what do you think? You've got experience in engaging people through science." Caught off guard, she straightened in her seat, closing her notebook. "Well," she started, glancing quickly at the man in the vest before focusing on Ezra. "I think it's important to connect emotionally, sure, but we also need to make sure the information we're sharing is clear and actionable. If people leave the festival inspired but don't know what steps to take, we've missed the mark." Across the circle, the man's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. Selene couldn't tell if it was approval or amusement. He tilted his head slightly, considering her. "Actionable," he repeated. His tone was not mocking, but there was a slight lilt to the word, as though he were turning it over in his mind like an artifact he'd found on the ground. "Yes, but action doesn't come from the head alone. You can tell someone to plant a tree, and they might. But if they feel the loss of the forest, if they can imagine the shade that generations will miss, they'll plant not just one tree, they'll plant a dozen." Selene fought the urge to roll her eyes. "Sure," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "But if we don't provide the tools, all they'll have is the feeling." "Perhaps," he conceded with a slight nod, as though she'd made a fair point. "Though I'd argue that the feeling is the tool." Ezra raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "Both good points. Let's plan for inspiration and action, shall we?" The man sat back again, his gaze lingering on Selene for a beat longer than she liked, before he turned his attention to the next person speaking. She exhaled quietly and opened her notebook again, forcing herself to refocus. As the meeting continued, Selene discovered that the man's name was Dr. Marcus Hale, a psychologist who had recently moved to Solara after years of teaching at a university. He spoke sparingly but with the same philosophical flair every time, weaving abstract concepts into the conversation like threads in a tapestry. If he had practical suggestions, Selene didn't hear them. When the meeting finally adjourned, she stood to gather her things. Marcus was already on his feet, and before she could slip away, he approached her. "You made a good point earlier," he said, his voice low but clear. He had a way of speaking as though every word mattered. "Thanks," she replied, unsure how to read him. "You certainly have a unique perspective." The corner of his mouth quirked up. "I'll take that as a compliment." Selene hesitated, then nodded. "Have a good evening," she said before turning to leave. She could feel his gaze on her as she walked away, and though she wouldn't admit it, not even to herself, she was already curious about the next meeting. The community hub was quiet at this hour, its usual hum of activity replaced by the soft rustle of papers and the occasional clink of a mug against the wooden table. The solar canopy overhead cast gentle patterns of moonlight on the floor, broken by the faint glow of a few warm lamps scattered throughout the space. Selene leaned over her notebook, pencil poised, eyebrows furrowed in concentration. Across from her sat Marcus, his vest discarded on the back of his chair, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. He was sketching something on a piece of scrap paper, his brow furrowed in that particular way she had already come to recognize as his deep thinking face. "So," Selene began, breaking the silence, If we're aiming for something immersive and emotional, like you keep saying, how does that actually look to a visitor? What's the first thing they see? Marcus didn't look up immediately, his pencil moving in slow, deliberate strokes. It's not just what they see, he replied after a moment. It's what they feel. Imagine stepping into a space where the air changes, cooler, darker, maybe the sound of leaves rustling or water dripping, something that pulls them out of their everyday mindset and into the moment. That's where the transformation begins. Selene exhaled through her nose, not quite a sigh, but close. Okay, but they still need to see something, right? Are we talking about an exhibit, a display, a sensory tunnel? She gestured vaguely, her pencil drawing an invisible arc in the air. We need to pin this down, otherwise it's just atmosphere. Marcus's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. Atmosphere is where it starts. But I see your point. He flipped his paper around to face her. His rough sketch showed a series of interconnected spaces, a central area surrounded by smaller alcoves. What if we create an interactive map of the mind? Each room could represent a different emotional state tied to an environmental dilemma. For example, one space could be about loss, deforestation maybe. Another could be about hope, renewable energy solutions. Selene leaned closer, studying the design. Okay, that's interesting, but how do we make it hands-on? People need to engage with it, not just walk through and look at displays. Marcus tapped his pencil against the table, his eyes narrowing in thought. What if we use simulations, he suggested. Like a virtual reality experience or even something tactile. They could touch objects that represent the impact of their choices. A charred tree branch for deforestation. A handful of soil teeming with life for sustainable farming. Selene's lips pursed as she considered it. I like the tactile idea, she admitted, scribbling a quick note in her notebook. Not everyone will want to put on a VR headset, and we don't have the budget for anything too high-tech. But physical objects could work. Maybe we could tie them to real-world actions, like picking up a seed packet for reforestation. Something they can take with them. Marcus watched her as she spoke, his head tilted slightly as though he were examining a rare bird he didn't want to startle. You're very pragmatic, he said, his tone more observational than complimentary. Grounded. Selene glanced up, meeting his gaze. Is that a bad thing? Not at all, he replied, his voice warm. It's refreshing. You have this way of taking my abstract musings and turning them into something tangible, something real. She blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. Unsure how to respond, she looked back down at her notebook. Well, someone has to, she muttered, though her lips curved into a faint smile. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the soft scratch of pencil on paper filling the space. Selene found herself glancing at Marcus occasionally, watching the way his fingers moved deftly over the page, the way his eyes lit up when he was struck with a new idea. He had a kind of energy about him, quiet but magnetic, that she hadn't noticed before. So, she said after a while, flipping to a fresh page in her notebook, what's your story? How does a psychologist end up here in an eco-village designing festival exhibits? Marcus sat back in his chair, his pencil paused mid-air. He seemed to consider her question carefully before answering. I guess you could say I got tired of just talking about change, he said finally. I spent years teaching, writing papers, giving lectures, all very theoretical. But the more I studied human behavior, the more it became clear that we can't separate mental well-being from the environment we live in. If we're disconnected from nature, from each other, how can we possibly thrive? I wanted to live somewhere that aligned with those values. Somewhere that was real. Selene nodded, her pencil still. I get that, she said softly. I came here for similar reasons. I love my work, studying ecosystems, conserving wildlife, but in the city, it always felt like I was fighting against the tide, like I was part of a system that didn't really care about the things I cared about. She looked down at her notebook, her voice lowering. Solara feels different. Like maybe here, those things actually matter. They do, Marcus said, his voice quiet but certain. And so do you. The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Selene wasn't sure how to respond. She glanced up, meeting Marcus's gaze. There was no teasing in his expression, no trace of his usual sly charm, just quiet sincerity. Feeling a sudden heat rise to her cheeks, Selene cleared her throat and looked back down at her notebook. "Well," she said briskly, "we'd better keep working if we're going to pull this off." Marcus chuckled softly, the tension in the air easing. "Right, back to work." But as they returned to their sketches and notes, Selene couldn't help but feel that something unspoken had shifted between them. The quiet hours of the night stretched on, and though their conversation returned to exhibits and logistics, there was a new warmth in their collaboration, a sense of connection that went beyond the festival they were planning. By the time they finally packed up their papers and headed out into the cool night air, Selene found herself looking forward to their next late-night session. And though she would never admit it, not yet anyway, she was starting to feel that Marcus Hale might be more than just a collaborator. The stars stretched endlessly above, a tapestry of light scattered across the deep indigo sky. Selene stood at the edge of the meadow just outside Solara, arms wrapped loosely around herself against the cool night breeze. The festival planning had run late again, the hours slipping by unnoticed until Ezra had finally shooed everyone home to rest. But instead of retreating to her small cottage, Selene had wandered out here, drawn by the stillness of the night. She heard footsteps behind her, soft and unhurried. Turning, she saw Marcus approaching, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the village behind him. He carried a blanket draped over one arm, the other hand tucked into the pocket of his ever-present vest. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then he gestured toward the open field with a tilt of his head. "Mind some company?" he asked, his voice warm but tentative, as though aware he might be intruding. Selene hesitated, then nodded. "Sure, it's too beautiful to keep to myself." Marcus stepped closer, spreading the blanket out on the soft grass before lowering himself to the ground. Selene followed, sitting beside him and tucking her knees against her chest. For several long moments, they sat in silence, gazing up at the stars. The only sounds were the gentle rustling of the grass and the distant hum of the wind turbines on the ridge. "It's strange, isn't it?" Marcus said finally, his voice low. "How small we are under all this." He gestured upward, not looking at her. "Makes the arguments, the plans, all of it feel insignificant." Selene glanced at him, his profile illuminated by the faint starlight. There was something in his tone she hadn't heard before, a kind of vulnerability that tugged at her. "Maybe that's why we need to try," she said softly, "because we are small, but if we don't care, if we don't fight for something, who will?" He turned to her then, his gaze meeting hers. His eyes, that striking gray-green, seemed softer tonight, searching. "You think it's enough? Caring?" "I think it's a start," she replied, "and maybe it's everything." Marcus smiled faintly, tipping his head back to look at the sky again. "You surprise me, Selene." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "How so?" "You're pragmatic," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Grounded, logical, but underneath it all, there's this fire. This belief that what we're doing matters. It's not just science to you. It's personal." Selene felt heat rise to her cheeks. She looked down at her hands, idly picking at the edge of the blanket. "It is," she admitted. "It has to be. Otherwise, what's the point?" He didn't answer right away, and when she glanced at him, she found him watching her again, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he leaned back, propping himself up on his elbows. "You're remarkable. You know that?" She let out a startled laugh, half disbelieving. "What?" "I mean it," Marcus said, his voice quiet but certain. "You have this way of seeing the world, clear, unflinching, but still full of hope. I can't decide if it's brave or reckless." "Maybe both," she said, smiling despite herself. She relaxed slightly, leaning back on her hands and letting her gaze drift skyward again. "And what about you? The philosopher who left everything behind to live in an eco-village. Brave or reckless?" Marcus chuckled, the sound deep and soft. "Touché." They sat like that for a while, the silence between them comfortable now, the stars above vast and unending. Selene felt a strange kind of stillness settle over her, as though the world had narrowed down to just this moment, just the two of them under the endless sky. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you ever feel like you're exactly where you're meant to be?" Selene turned her head, her eyes meeting his. The vulnerability she'd heard earlier was there again, clear in his expression now, and for a moment She forgot to breathe. She nodded. Yes, she said, her voice almost breaking. I do. Neither of them moved, the space between them charged with something unspoken but undeniable. The stars above seemed to pulse with it, the night holding its breath. And in that quiet, infinite moment, Selene realized with startling clarity just how deeply she was beginning to care for him. Selene was pulling weeds from one of the raised garden beds when she first heard the familiar sound of her mother's voice, sharp, precise, and just loud enough to carry through the warm afternoon air. I'm just saying it's smaller than I expected, and rustic. Selene's breath caught, her hands freezing mid-motion. She slowly straightened, dirt clinging to her gloves, and turned toward the sound. Her parents stood at the edge of the garden path, their crisp city attire stark against the earthy tones of Solara. Her mother, Eleanor, was impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blazer and heels that sank slightly into the gravel. Her dark hair was styled in its usual smooth bob, not a strand out of place. Beside her stood Selene's father, Richard, his tie loosened but his posture rigid, his expression hovering somewhere between discomfort and disapproval. "What are you doing here?" Selene asked, her voice tight as she pulled off her gloves and wiped her hands on her jeans. "Surprise," Eleanor said brightly, though her tone lacked any real warmth. "We thought we'd drop by and see how you're doing. You didn't answer my last few messages." "I've been busy," Selene replied, glancing around as if someone might save her. The garden was unusually quiet, the other volunteers having moved to the greenhouse for the afternoon shift. Richard surveyed the garden with a critical eye, his gaze lingering on the solar panels glinting in the distance and the wooden trellises draped with vines. "This is where you've been living? Working?" "Yes." Selene crossed her arms, bracing herself. Eleanor stepped forward, her heels crunching on the gravel. "It's quaint, I'll give you that. But Selene, don't you think it's time to stop playing around? You've had your little adventure. Now it's time to come back to the city and focus on a real career." "A real career?" Selene repeated, her voice sharp. "I'm working to protect ecosystems, to make a difference. This isn't some hobby, Mom." Eleanor sighed, her expression softening in a way that felt patronizing rather than kind. "Sweetheart, I know you mean well, but how is any of this sustainable? This village, it's charming, yes, but it's not the real world. You're wasting your talent here." Selene felt the heat rising in her chest, a mix of anger and frustration tightening her throat. "Wasting my talent? Mom, the work I do here is important. We're building something meaningful, something that actually matters." Richard cleared his throat, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "We're not saying what you do doesn't matter, Selene, but you need to think about your future. This kind of lifestyle, it's not viable in the long run. You're an intelligent woman with a degree from a top university. You could be working for a major corporation, earning a stable income, building a career with real opportunities." "I don't want to work for a corporation," Selene snapped, her voice rising despite herself. "I don't want to sit in an office pushing papers for some company that doesn't actually care about the environment. That's not who I am." Eleanor pressed her lips into a thin line. "And who are you exactly? Someone who spends her days planting vegetables and living off the grid? Is this the life you really want? No stability? No career progression? No?" "Enough," Selene interrupted, her hands clenching into fists. She took a deep breath, forcing her voice to steady. "I know you don't understand this place, this work, and that's fine, but don't come here and act like my life is some kind of mistake just because it doesn't look like yours." Her mother's eyes widened slightly, as though Selene had slapped her. Eleanor tucked her hands into the pockets of her blazer, composing herself. "We're only trying to help, Selene. You've always been so passionate, so driven. We just don't want you to throw away everything you've worked for on this." "This isn't a waste," Selene said through gritted teeth. "I'm happy here. I found a place where I belong, a community that shares my values. I'm doing work that I care about. Isn't that what you've always wanted for me?" Richard exchanged a glance with Eleanor before looking back at Selene. "We want you to be happy, yes, but we also want you to be realistic. You can't live like this forever. At some point, you'll need to think about stability, about a proper future, about family." Selene stared at them, her stomach churning. You mean a future that looks like yours? Well, I'm sorry, but I don't want that. This is my life, not yours. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken words and lingering disappointment. Eleanor exhaled sharply, shaking her head. Fine, if that's how you feel, but don't expect us to stand by and watch you throw your potential away. Richard placed a hand on Eleanor's arm, his expression unreadable. We should go, he said quietly. Selene didn't move as they turned and walked back down the garden path, their sharp silhouettes fading into the distance. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her breath coming in uneven bursts. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn. Marcus stood a few feet away, his brow furrowed, his hands tucked into his pockets. He must have heard everything. You okay? He asked softly. Selene nodded quickly, though her throat burned with the effort to hold back tears. Yeah, just give me a minute. Marcus hesitated, then nodded, stepping back to give her space. Selene stood alone in the garden, the weight of her parents' words heavy on her shoulders. But as she looked out at the rows of plants, the solar panels gleaming in the sunlight, she reminded herself why she was here, why she'd chosen this life, and why she wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her. The dining room was suffused with an unnatural stillness, the kind that came when words had carved too deep. Marcus sat at the end of the long wooden table, his hands resting on either side of his plate, untouched silverware glinting under the soft glow of the solar chandelier overhead. Across from him sat his older brother, Andrew, his suit crisp and tailored, the kind of outfit that didn't belong in Solara. Their mother, Vivienne, was seated to Marcus's left, her fingers delicately cradling the stem of a wine glass as though it might shatter under her grip. The tension in the room was palpable, sharp as the edge of the knife tucked beside Marcus's untouched dinner roll. So you've really traded a lecture hall for this? Andrew gestured vaguely toward the window behind Marcus, where the village lights shimmered faintly in the distance. His voice was calm but laced with incredulity. A psychologist living in a commune, designing, what was it again? Exhibits for festivals? This is your life now? It's not a commune, Marcus said evenly, though his jaw tightened. It's an eco-village, and what we're doing here matters. Andrew leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Ah, yes, saving the world one seedling at a time. His eyes flicked toward Vivienne. Mother, do you want to weigh in, or shall I continue being the voice of reason? Vivienne sighed, setting her glass down with a soft clink. She folded her hands neatly in her lap, her expression carefully composed, sympathetic, but underneath it unmistakably disappointed. Marcus, your brother isn't wrong to be concerned. Growing your own vegetables and living off renewable energy, it's admirable, I suppose, but it's not sustainable, not for someone with your education, your potential. And your family name, Andrew added with a sharp smile. It's not exactly great PR for the Hales when one of us decides to drop out of society. I didn't drop out of anything, Marcus snapped, his voice low but firm. I made a choice, a conscious, deliberate choice, to live in a place that aligns with my values, to be part of something meaningful. And how's that going for you? Andrew asked, his tone cutting. Meaningful doesn't pay the bills, does it? Or do you barter philosophy lessons for food in this quaint little utopia of yours? Enough, Marcus said, his voice louder this time. He pushed his chair back slightly, the wood scraping against the floor. The calm veneer he had carefully maintained began to crack. You think I don't know what you're doing? You come here, dressed like you've just stepped out of a boardroom, and you sit here judging me for not following your version of success. But what you don't see, what you'll never see, is that I'm actually happy here. For the first time in years, I'm doing work that feels real, that helps people. Vivienne's brow furrowed, and for a moment her mask slipped. She looked at him, truly looked at him, with something close to regret. Marcus, no one is questioning your intelligence or your passion. You've always been the dreamer in the family. But dreams don't last forever. We're worried about you, about your future. Marcus laughed bitterly, shaking his head. No, you're worried about appearances, about what your friends will think when they find out I'm not holed up in some prestigious university writing books no one will read. God forbid a Hale actually steps off the treadmill of greed and ambition to try and make the world a better place. Andrew's chair creaked as he leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. His voice was quiet but no less sharp. You think we don't care about the world? About people? We run businesses, Marcus. We create jobs, opportunities. What exactly have you created here? A vegetable garden and some idealistic daydreams? Marcus opened his mouth to reply, but Vivienne raised a hand, her tone soft but firm. Andrew, please. She turned back to Marcus, her eyes searching his face. If this is truly what you want, I won't stop you. But you should know, you're isolating yourself. From us, from the life you could have had. And if this experiment of yours doesn't work out, I just hope you're prepared for the consequences. The weight of her words pressed down on Marcus's chest, but he refused to let it show. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I don't need your approval. I never have. But I'd hoped, at the very least, that you could respect my choice. Vivienne flinched slightly, but said nothing, her eyes dropping to the tablecloth. Andrew, meanwhile, leaned back, his expression unreadable. Marcus turned, his fists clenched, and walked toward the door. Before he left, he paused, his back to them. You asked what I've created here. I've created a life worth living. If you can't understand that, then maybe you never really knew me at all. The door clicked softly behind him, and Marcus stepped out into the cool night air, his breath coming in sharp bursts. His hands trembled slightly as he pushed them into his pockets, his mind racing with their words, their doubts. He glanced up at the stars, their quiet, steady light, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. Marcus? Selene's voice broke through the silence, pulling him back. She stood a few steps away, her hair loose around her shoulders, concern etched into her features. Did you hear that? He asked, his voice rough. She nodded, stepping closer. Most of it. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared past her at the distant hills. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, They think I'm wasting my life. Selene hesitated, then reached out, her hand brushing his arm. They don't know what it's like here, what it's like to care about something bigger than yourself. He looked at her then, his eyes heavy with doubt and something deeper. What if they're right? They're not, she said firmly, and deep down, you know that. Her words wrapped around him like a lifeline, and though the doubt didn't vanish, it quieted. With a soft exhale, he nodded, letting her steady presence ground him. Together, under the vast expanse of stars, they stood in silent solidarity against the weight of expectations neither of them wanted to carry. The night air was cool against Selene's skin as she sat on the edge of the wooden pergola in Solara's square, her legs dangling over the side. The soft glow of solar string lights above her cast a golden hue over the deserted space, the hum of the nearby wind turbines the only sound breaking the stillness. She pulled her sweater tighter around herself, staring at the darkened silhouette of the valley beyond. Her chest was heavy, weighed down by the confrontation with her parents earlier that day. Their voices still echoed in her head, pointed, sharp, full of judgment. She had held her ground, but now, with the adrenaline gone, doubt had crept in, wrapping itself around her like a cold mist. Was she being selfish? Idealistic? She didn't think so, but their words had a way of burrowing into her, finding the cracks. A sound behind her broke through her thoughts. Footsteps, unhurried. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. Couldn't sleep? Marcus asked softly as he approached, his hands tucked into his pockets. He looked as worn as she felt, his usually crisp shirt rumpled, his hair tousled in a way that suggested he'd been running his fingers through it. She could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the faint shadow of something unresolved in his eyes. Not really, she admitted, her voice low. You? He shook his head, stopping a few feet away. No. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Marcus gestured to the edge of the pergola. Mind if I join you? Selene slid over slightly in silent invitation, and he climbed onto the ledge, settling beside her. They sat in silence, the space between them filled with the quiet hum of Solara at rest. The warm light from the solar canopy above softened the hard lines of his face, but Selene could still see the tension in the subtle furrow of his brow, the way his jaw was tight, like he was holding back something he couldn't quite say. Finally, she broke the silence. How bad was it? Marcus glanced at her, his lips pressing into a thin line. Dinner with my family? He exhaled, the sound halfway between a sigh and a bitter laugh. It was predictable. Andrew played the sharp-tongued realist, Mother played the disappointed optimist, and I played the black sheep who doesn't live up to anyone's expectations. Selene tilted her head toward him slightly, her voice soft. I heard some of it when you came outside. It sounded awful. It wasn't great, Marcus admitted, his gaze fixed on the horizon. It's always the same conversation, really. They think I'm wasting my education, tarnishing the family name, chasing some foolish dream. And every time I try to explain why this matters, they look at me like I'm a child playing make-believe. Selene nodded, her heart aching in a way that surprised her. Yeah, that sounds familiar. He turned to her, his brow lifting slightly. Your parents? They came by earlier, she said, her voice quieter now. Uninvited, of course. They don't understand this place, what we're trying to do here. To them, it's a phase, something I'll grow out of once I come to my senses. She paused, her hands curling into fists on her lap. They think I'm throwing my life away. That I should be working for some corporate giant in the city, climbing the ladder like a good little professional. Marcus studied her for a moment, his expression softening. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it. I know how much their approval means to you. Selene shook her head, her teeth worrying her bottom lip. I thought I didn't care anymore. I thought I'd made peace with the fact that they'll never really understand me. But today? She trailed off, staring down at her hands. I guess part of me still wants them to see what I see, to believe in this as much as I do. Marcus looked at her, his gray-green eyes thoughtful. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who see us the least. They're too busy looking at the idea of who they think we should be. Selene glanced at him, something in his words striking a chord deep within her. Yeah, she said softly. That's exactly what it feels like. They fell into another silence, the kind that felt less like avoidance and more like understanding, the kind that didn't demand to be filled because it already held the weight of everything unspoken. After a while, Marcus shifted, turning slightly to face her. Selene, he began, his voice careful, deliberate. Do you ever wonder if it's worth it? Fighting so hard for this life, this work, when it feels like no one else sees the point? She looked at him, startled by the vulnerability in his tone. It wasn't like him to voice his doubts so plainly. Yes, she said after a moment. All the time, especially when people like my parents come around, reminding me how easy it would be to just give up, go back to the city, take the path of least resistance. Marcus nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. Sometimes I wonder if they're right, if I made the wrong choice, if I'm just running away from the life I couldn't handle. You're not, Selene said firmly, the words escaping her before she could think them through. He looked up at her, startled, and she held his gaze. You're not running away. You're running towards something better, something real. The smallest of smiles tugged at the corners of his mouth, and for a moment some of the weight seemed to lift from his shoulders. Thank you, he said softly. I needed to hear that. She smiled back, her heart beating a little faster. You know, I might need to hear it too, sometimes, if we're going to keep going. He nodded, his expression turning serious. Then we say it, to each other, as many times as we need. Selene felt her chest tighten, not with doubt this time, but with something steadier, something stronger. Deal. They sat there for a while longer, their shoulders just barely brushing, the weight of their family's disapproval still present but somehow lighter now, shared between them. Eventually, Marcus spoke again, his voice quiet but resolute. We can't let them define us, Selene, or what we're building here. They don't have to understand it. We just have to live it. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Together. Together, he echoed, and for the first time in days, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. The late afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of Solara's central square, casting golden light on the gathering of villagers. Selene stood at the edge of the square, her parents in front of her, their polished shoes planted firmly on the earth they seemed so out of place on. To her left, Marcus straightened his vest, his mother and brother standing stiffly nearby. The hum of quiet conversation from the others in the square faded as Selene took a deep breath and stepped forward, her heart pounding. I need you to listen, she began, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Eleanor folded her arms, her expression cool, while Richard frowned but nodded for her to continue. Selene glanced at Marcus, who gave her a small, encouraging nod before she went on. I understand that this isn't the life you imagined for me, that it doesn't fit the picture you had of who I was supposed to be. But this is who I am. What I'm doing here, the work, the community, it matters to me. And I won't apologize for choosing a path that feels right in my heart, even if you don't agree with it. Eleanor opened her mouth to interject, but Selene held up a hand, her voice firm now. I love you. I always will. But I can't live my life trying to meet your expectations. I have to live it for me. Before her parents could respond, Marcus stepped up beside her, his presence grounding her. He turned to his mother and brother, his voice calm but resolute. What Selene said goes for me too. I know you think I've turned my back on the family, on the life you wanted for me, but the truth is, I've found something here that gives my life meaning, that makes me feel alive. I don't expect you to understand, but I do need you to respect my choice. Andrew's lips tightened, while Vivienne hesitated, her eyes softening as she looked at her son. Marcus, she began, but he stepped closer, his gaze steady. This is my home, he said simply, and I'm not leaving it. Selene reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. Turning back to their families, they stood together, unshaken. We've chosen this life, Selene said, her voice clear, and we're building a future we believe in. We hope you can be part of it, but if not, we'll still keep going, together. The silence that followed stretched long, but Selene's heart felt lighter. For the first time, she wasn't afraid. The morning of the festival dawned bright and clear, the valley of Solara shimmering like a jewel under the golden sunlight. The square buzzed with energy as villagers hurried to put the final touches on their exhibits, the scent of freshly baked bread and wildflowers mingling in the crisp air. Selene stood near the main entrance, clipboard in hand, scanning the growing crowd with a mixture of nervousness and pride. Everything's in place. Marcus's voice came from behind her, calm yet tinged with excitement. She turned to see him carrying a stack of brochures, his sleeves rolled up, a faint smudge of dirt on his otherwise crisp shirt. The first visitors just arrived, and Ezra's already giving them the welcome tour. Selene exhaled, her lips curving into a smile. It's actually happening. Marcus handed her a brochure, their fingertips brushing briefly. It's more than happening. It's alive. He gestured to the square, where the immersive exhibits they had spent countless late nights designing were now bustling with people. Children ran laughing toward the sensory garden, their hands trailing over fragrant plants, while families clustered around the tactile displays of environmental dilemmas and solutions. In one corner, visitors gathered under a canopy of fluttering ribbons, each inscribed with messages of hope written by the community the night before. Look at that! Selene murmured as a young boy picked up a small seed packet from the reforestation exhibit. A volunteer knelt beside him, explaining how to plant it in his own backyard. Selene's chest swelled with pride. They're not just learning, they're connecting. That was the plan, wasn't it? Marcus said, smiling. He tilted his head toward the interactive map of the mind, where a group of adults were absorbed in the experience. Your insistence on tactile engagement paid off. They're touching the charred branch and grabbing the soil like their lives depend on it. Selene laughed softly, elbowing him. And your atmospheric concepts weren't half bad either. Marcus grinned, his gaze lingering on her. We make a good team. She felt a warmth rise in her cheeks, but didn't look away. We really do. As the festival pulsed with life around them, Marcus reached for her hand, his touch steady and grounding. This is just the beginning, he said softly. And in that moment, surrounded by the vision they had brought to life, Selene believed him. The festival was in full bloom as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting a golden glow over Solara's central square. The air hummed with laughter, music, and the gentle rustle of wind through the vines that framed the pergola. Beneath it, villagers gathered in a loose, intimate circle, their faces glowing with warmth and anticipation as they turned toward Selene and Marcus, who stood hand in hand at the center. Selene found herself momentarily breathless as she looked out at the crowd. Familiar faces surrounded her, Ezra, beaming with pride. Olivia, her hands still speckled with soil from the greenhouse but clutching a bouquet of wildflowers. Even the children, sitting cross-legged near the front, their usually playful chatter stilled with curiosity and awe. Above them, strands of solar string lights twinkled, their soft illumination weaving magic into the twilight. But it was Marcus who held her attention most. He stood close, his gray-green eyes fixed on hers, a quiet steadiness in his gaze that seemed to anchor her. His sleeves were rolled up as always, his vest slightly rumpled from a day of festival activity. Yet in this moment, he looked impossibly elegant, his expression carrying the weight of every word they'd shared, every dream they'd built together. Ezra stepped forward, his voice warm and clear as he addressed the crowd. Here in Solara, we believe in beginnings, whether it's the start of a new season, a new idea, or a new chapter of life. Tonight, we gather not just to celebrate our vision for a better future, but to honor two people who embody that vision. Selene and Marcus, in your love, we see hope, resilience, and the promise of what this community stands for. And so, in the place you've helped nourish, under these lights powered by the sun, we witness the commitment you make to one another. Selene felt her throat tighten, her fingers curling more firmly around Marcus's as Ezra nodded gently and stepped back, leaving the space between them open. The only sound was the wind stirring the ribbons above, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender and earth. Marcus turned to her fully then, his voice low but steady as he began. Selene, when I first came to Solara, I was looking for something I couldn't quite name. I thought it might be purpose or peace, but what I found was you. You've shown me that love isn't just something we feel. It's something we build, something we nurture, like the roots of a tree growing deeper with time. You ground me, inspire me, and remind me every day why this life matters. Today, I promise to walk beside you, to dream with you, to fight for what we believe in, and to love you with all that I am, for today, for tomorrow, for always. His voice faltered slightly at the end, his emotions spilling into his expression. Selene felt her eyes sting, but she didn't look away. She could feel the weight of his words settle into her chest, warm and unshakable as the earth beneath her feet. Her own voice trembled as she began. Marcus, when I first met you, I thought we couldn't be more different. You, with your philosophies and your endless questions. Me, with my focus on facts, on what I could see and measure. But somewhere in the late nights and shared visions, I realized that you weren't just a mystery to solve. You were the answer I didn't know I was searching for. You've taught me to see the world differently, to wonder, to hope. You are my partner in every sense of the word, and today I promise to love you, not despite our differences, but because of them. I promise to stand with you, to believe in you, and to grow with you, no matter where this path takes us. Her voice broke on the last word, and Marcus reached up instinctively, brushing a stray tear from her cheek. She smiled through the emotion, her heart impossibly full, as the crowd around them seemed to breathe as one. Ezra stepped forward again, holding a simple wooden box adorned with carved vines. Inside were 2 rings, handcrafted from Solara's own materials, recycled silver, inlaid with small polished stones gathered from the valley. Marcus took the smaller of the 2 and slid it gently onto Selene's finger, his hand steady against hers. With this ring, he said softly, I give you my heart, my trust, my forever. Selene picked up the second ring, her fingers brushing his as she placed it on his hand. With this ring, she echoed, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes, I give you my love, my faith, my always. The moment hung suspended, the crowd silent and reverent. Then Ezra's voice, full of joy, broke through. It is my honor to pronounce you partners in love, in life, and in this beautiful, crazy world we share. The square erupted in cheers and applause, villagers clapping and whistling as Selene and Marcus leaned into each other, their foreheads touching. Around them, the solar lights glimmered brighter, casting their glow over the valley as if the sun itself was blessing their union. And as their lips met in a kiss, Selene felt the world around her fade, leaving only the man she loved and the life they were building together. The last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, painting the valley in hues of amber and violet. Solara's central square glowed with the soft light of solar lanterns, their golden warmth casting intricate patterns over the gathered crowd. The hum of the festival had softened now, the exhibits winding down, leaving only the shared satisfaction of a day well spent. Villagers milled about with glasses of sparkling cider, their laughter and conversation mingling with the faint rustle of the wind through the vines above. Selene stood at the center of it all, her hand firmly clasped in Marcus's. She felt the roughness of his palm against hers, grounding her in the moment. Around her, their community, gathered in a loose semicircle, faces alight with pride and joy. Ezra stepped forward, his weathered features glowing as he held up a simple glass. "To Solara," he began, his voice carrying easily over the gentle murmurs. The crowd fell silent, turning their attention to him. "To the vision we've built and the future we're growing. From the smallest seed to the brightest light, this day has been a reminder of what we can achieve when we come together." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Ezra's eyes settled on Selene and Marcus. "And to Selene and Marcus," he said, his smile widening, "for leading with heart and determination, for showing us that connection between people, between ideas, between heart and mind is what truly drives change. Today's festival is proof that dreams rooted in action can bloom into something extraordinary." Selene felt a flush creep up her neck, but it wasn't embarrassment. It was something warmer, more profound. She glanced up at Marcus, whose lips curved into that quiet, steady smile she'd come to cherish. His fingers tightened around hers, a silent reassurance. Ezra raised his glass higher, to a future where we continue to balance hope with action, love with courage, and life with purpose. To Selene and Marcus, and to all of us here in Solara, cheers! Cheers! The crowd echoed, their glasses lifting toward the sky. The lanterns overhead glimmered in the twilight, their light catching the edges of every raised glass. Selene caught Olivia's eye and saw the proud, knowing smile that lingered there. She saw children giggling as they clinked glasses of juice, elders wrapping arms around one another, and strangers exchanging looks that spoke of newfound friendship. This moment, this community, it was everything she'd dreamed of and so much more. "Say something," Marcus murmured beside her, his voice low and teasing. She shot him a look half amused, half nervous. But then she let go of his hand and stepped forward. The crowd stilled, their attention shifting to her, and Selene's voice rose, steady despite the rush of emotion in her chest. "When I came to Solara," she began, her eyes sweeping across the familiar faces, "I was looking for a place where I could make a difference, a place that felt alive and real in a world that so often felt disconnected. What I found was so much more than that. I found a community. A purpose. A home." Her gaze flickered briefly to Marcus, the warmth in his eyes giving her the courage to go on. "And I found love," she said, her voice softening but carrying. "A love that, like this place, is built on shared values, mutual respect, and a belief in something bigger than ourselves. Together, Marcus and I are committed to this life, to this community, and to the future we're shaping here. Thank you for welcoming us, for believing in us, and for standing beside us." The crowd erupted in applause, and as Selene stepped back, Marcus reached for her hand again, pulling her close. He leaned in, his lips brushing her ear. "You were perfect," he whispered. "So were you," she replied, her voice catching. Ezra clapped his hands, calling for music to start, and soon the square was alive again with the sound of laughter and celebration. But in the center of it all, standing beside Marcus and surrounded by the people she'd come to love, Selene felt a quiet certainty settle over her. She was exactly where she was meant to be.